I awoke upon hard rock, my entire body aching as I struggled to open my eyes. It took a moment to remember the horror I'd just been through. I fought past the pain and sat up, frantically searching my body for wounds. I was near naked, only wearing old rags to cover my dignity. But this didn't worry me in that moment. My last memory before I'd blacked out was being stabbed through the chest. There had been a riot at the high-security prison where I'd worked for the past decade. I'd seen violence during my career, but never this bad. I got cut off from my comrades on the wing, ambushed by a bloodthirsty gang member who came at me with a shiv. I recalled the intense, overwhelming pain as the knife penetrated, and then everything went dark. But when I searched my naked chest, I couldn't find any stab wounds on my body. I should have felt grateful, but none of this made sense. I'd felt the knife, seen my own blood. Was it all a delusion? I parked this thought for a moment while trying to work out where I was. The prison hospital seemed like the natural place to end up, but I wasn't in the hospital or even inside the prison. Looking around, I found myself in a dark cave, with only a sliver of light emanating from a narrow entrance about 20 yards from where I lay. On the ceiling above me were stalactites. One was hanging directly above me. The formation appeared flimsy, and I feared it could give way at any moment, impaling me in the process. This fear made me move quickly. It was only then that I discovered the cold iron collar fixed around my neck. I struggled to remove the restraint, but found it was attached to a long metal chain, affixed to my shackle and stretching across to the cave's exit and beyond. I pulled hard against the chain, releasing some slack, but finding it was secured to yet another unidentified heavy weight on the other end. I felt anger in that moment as I engaged in a futile struggle to free myself. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been a prison guard, a man in a position of power who kept dangerous criminals locked away. But now, I was the prisoner, near naked and in chains. The humiliation was nearly unbearable. Still, I couldn't understand what was happening to me. Had I been taken hostage? Possibly. But this didn't explain my location. The cave was uncomfortably hot and muggy. There was only one way in or out that I could see, the narrow exit where the chain led. The sun shone through the gap, warming my bare skin. It made sense that I should walk out into the light, and yet I hesitated. Something told me it wasn't safe out there. Call it a sixth sense, but I felt I would be in grave danger as soon as I stepped out of the cave. I was still trying to decide what to do when the decision was taken out of my hands, because a moment later, something started to pull on the far end of the chain. Once again I fought, trying desperately to hold my ground as I was pulled out into the open air, accepting my fate as I adjusted to my new environment. As uncomfortable as the cave was, the outside was worse. A baking hot sun shone down upon my head, and I was forced to walk upon scorching sand which burnt the soles of my bare feet. I glanced back at where I'd come from. The cave was cut into the side of a solitary mountain which towered over an otherwise barren desert of white sand stretching in every direction. But what really concerned me was the contraption at the end of the chain. It was a large wagon made of solid wooden planks and set on top of two pairs of spoke wheels. The wagon was more of a cart in actual fact, but it was huge in dimensions, easily 20 feet wide and 40 feet in length. The bed was open to the elements. It didn't carry a cargo, not yet anyway. The cart was being pulled across the sands and the chain attached to my collar was secured to its bed, meaning I was dragged along with it. But most shocking was the gang chained to the wagon, because the vehicle wasn't being pulled by horses or camels. It was powered by human beings. Mostly men, but also a few women. All thin, bedraggled, dressed in filthy rags similar to my own, with their skins burnt by the unforgiving sun. They all had collars around their necks just like I did, and every collar was attached to a chain affixed to the wagon's bed. The chain gang members differed in ages and racial backgrounds. There didn't seem to be much linking them, other than their shared precarious situation. I counted 36 queued up in 3 lines. Some seemed to be in a state of shock or acute anxiety, which was understandable given the circumstances. But more disturbing were those who seemed resigned to their grim fate, their heads down and eyes sullen. Most looked exhausted, and a few appeared to be on the verge of collapse. But all were pulling their backs to the desert, facing the cart and the mountain as they walked backwards, using all their strength to drag the cart forward with their bare hands. I didn't understand it, couldn't comprehend any of this. But one thing was for certain. The chain around my neck was secure, and I had no choice but to join their number. And so I shuffled forward to take my place in the line. I looked to the burnt and sunken faces of those I had passed, trying to make eye contact and engage somebody in conversation, but no one would talk to me. Their heads remained down and they kept on pulling, as if dragging the wretched wooden cart forward was the most important task in the universe. I didn't recognize any of their number, except for one.
Well, well, well. Look what the cat dragged in. Great to see you again, Officer Dillon.
I looked to the foul-faced, smirking prisoner to my right and groaned in dismay. I knew this man, unfortunately. Prisoner number 5267. Name: Frank O'Neill. A small-time hustler and burglar serving a 5-year stretch. O'Neill was also a jailhouse snitch, which meant he was held in the protective custody wing, enjoying special privileges thanks to the information he'd supplied. Needless to say, O'Neill hadn't been popular with his fellow prisoners. I never liked him either, if truth be told. He wasn't the worst or most dangerous inmate I had to deal with, but there was something off about the guy, and I didn't trust him. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, attempting to regain some of my former authority. But O'Neill merely laughed in my face.
Easy, pal. You're not in charge anymore.
O'Neill's smile dropped and his tone softened when he spoke.
I don't know what this place is exactly, but I know one thing. The old rules don't apply here.
I frowned in frustration. O'Neill's words hadn't provided much insight, but for better or for worse, I was about to receive the answers I desired. A second man called back to me from the front of the line, an emaciated elderly man with a long white beard and disheveled hair. He smiled at me to reveal broken yellow teeth. The old-timer wasn't much to look at. He was physically weak, and so surely couldn't exert much strength to pull the wagon forward. Still, his demeanor seemed friendly, and his eyes still contained a spark of hope and humanity. When he spoke, the others in the line listened, and I noted the canteen he carried, slung over his bony shoulder.
"Greetings, my new friend. Welcome to the chain gang. You look thirsty."
He deftly pulled the canteen off his shoulder and tossed it into my waiting hands.
"Please, take a drink, but ration yourself. The water sustains us all."
I gave him a puzzled look. One small canteen couldn't possibly hold enough water for 36 people. Nevertheless, I wouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth. Opening the canteen, I took a swig of cold water, and I felt much better once I swallowed the refreshing liquid. I handed the canteen back to the old-timer and thanked him.
"Not a problem, sir. We all look out for each other around here. My name is Gabe, by the way. And you?"
"Tommy," I replied after a lengthy pause. I thought it was better to use my first name rather than refer to my rank.
"Pleased to meet you, Tommy."
Gabe broke his position in the line to shake my hand. Only then did I notice that I'd started pulling on my chain, joining the others in the shared task of dragging the cart along the sand, even though I didn't understand why I was doing so.
I've been trying to explain how things work to your friend here.
Gabe continued while nodding towards O'Neill.
Unfortunately, he's finding it hard to adjust.
That old fool's crazy.
O'Neill proclaimed loudly. I cast him a stern look before turning back to Gabe. This man is not my friend, I said firmly. O'Neill laughed in open mockery, but Gabe appeared visibly disappointed by my statement.
Well, Tommy, I'm sorry to hear this, because we all need to work together out here. Whatever differences you men had in life must be left on the mortal plane.
His last sentence chilled me to my bones as I considered the implication of his words. What do you mean by mortal plane? I asked nervously. The old man's smile dropped, and I was sure I could see a sadness in his eyes. And when he answered, his tone was noticeably more sympathetic.
Oh dear. I am sorry, Tommy. This is always the most difficult part of my job. I hope new arrivals will discover the truth on their own time, but sometimes I must force the matter.
I shook my head, still none the wiser, or perhaps too stubborn to accept my new reality. Gabe sighed when he saw the puzzlement in my eyes.
What is the last thing you remember, Tommy, before you arrived here?
I paused for a moment, not wanting to relive the trauma but realizing I had to do so. There was a riot where I worked. A prisoner came at me with a homemade knife. He stabbed me multiple times, and then I blacked out. Gabe shook his head, placing his bony hand on my arm as he whispered in my ear.
Oh, my dear Thomas.
I found this strange because nobody had ever called me Thomas except for my late mother.
Poor Thomas. I'm afraid you didn't black out after the attack. You died. You're deceased, and this is the afterlife.
I instinctively backed away from the old man. My first impulse was to punch him, but thankfully I resisted the urge. Instead, I scoffed with contempt and treated his revelation with open mockery. You're kidding, right? I said with a nervous laugh.
I'm afraid not,
Gabe answered sternly. I don't believe in heaven and hell.
And yet here you are.
You see? I told you this guy was nuts.
That was O'Neill, who'd been listening in our conversation. Presumably, Gabe had told O'Neill the same thing when he'd arrived on the line. But Gabe ignored the other prisoner as he focused his attention on me in that tense moment.
Look around you, Thomas. How can you explain your presence here? But, more importantly, look inside yourself. Only then can you embrace the reality of your circumstances.
Gabe left me to my thoughts for a time, once again taking his place at the head of the chain gang as we continued to pull. I looked to the other prisoners in the gang. O'Neill was animated, but the others kept their heads down, their focus entirely on the physically challenging task of pulling the cart. I looked up to the sun above, and then to the desert all around us, racking my brain for any other logical explanation for my presence here. It had been winter where I come from. There'd literally been snow on the ground when I reported from my shift. But now I was here, trekking through a barren desert I'd never seen before. I did briefly wonder whether I'd been drugged or was suffering from a psychotic episode. These were possibilities. But Gabe's advice was chillingly accurate. I did look inside myself, and I realized that something significant had changed. I'd never believed in heaven and hell, God and the devil, but seeing and feeling was believing. In my heart, I knew I was dead, and this was my new reality. I mourned for the life I once had, but not for long. It was a sharp shock to discover I was now dead, not to mention finding myself in an immortal realm outside of the world I once knew. But then, what had I really lost? My marriage had ended years earlier. I had no children, my parents were both dead. I'd hardly known my father since he died when I was young. I'd been close to my mother, though, paying for her care during her long illness and nearly bankrupting myself in the process. It nearly broke me when she passed. I still had my job in the prison. Just about. I'd been officially cleared after the investigation into the major incident last year. They had no proof of my involvement. But things weren't going well for me back on the mortal plane, and I was self-aware enough to accept this. I pondered my grim situation as I pulled alongside my new comrades, exerting much physical effort as we slowly dragged the cart along the hot sands, working together like a trio of tug-of-war teams. I looked to my fellow prisoners, again noting their emaciated bodies, sunburnt skin, and hands red and raw from the constant friction with the chains. Who were these people? Presumably they were all dead just like me, but why were we here? And what was the purpose of this seemingly pointless task assigned to us? I still needed answers, and it seemed Gabe was the only man who could provide them. Glancing over my shoulder, I shouted to the old-timer, but before he could answer, our attention was drawn to the ever-devious Frank O'Neill. The prison snitch suddenly howled in celebration, and I soon saw why. He had a small lockpick on his person. Where it was hidden I couldn't say, but I could hazard a guess based on previous experience. In any event, O'Neill had been quietly working away with the improvised tool and had succeeded in picking the lock on his iron collar. Now O'Neill was free, and he wasn't going to stick around. He shot me a sly wink and sadistic smile before speaking his parting words.
So long, Officer Dillon. Oh, how the mighty have fallen.
I was left speechless, but Gabe tried to reason with the man.
Francis, you cannot leave the line. We all need to stick together.
Screw you, old-timer. I'm finding my own way out.
Don't do it, Francis.
But Frank O'Neill would not listen. He set out into the desert, running from the cart and line across the hot sands. But he didn't get far. The attacker emerged as if from nowhere, a black dot galloping over the hillside but charging forward at great speed. What I saw was an extraordinary creature, half beast and half human, his top half that of a man but with 4 sturdy legs resembling those of a horse. The centaur howled with fury as he came, his long braid blowing in the wind and with a murderous glint in his dark eyes as he brandished a sharp spear in his right hand. O'Neill saw the centaur late. He screamed in terror and tried to flee back to the wagon, but it was too late for that. The centaur threw his spear with all his might, hitting O'Neill square in the back, right between his shoulder blades. The prison snitch squealed in agony as he fell to the sands. He looked up at me with terror in his eyes, still conscious but surely doomed. The centaur galloped back, grabbing the end of his spear which was still embedded in his victim's back. He didn't remove the pike from O'Neill's flesh, instead using it to drag the poor man's body back into the desert. The doomed prisoner was still screaming as hunter and prey disappeared over the hillside to an unknown fate. I was sickened by what I'd just witnessed. True, I hadn't liked Frank O'Neill, but nobody deserved such a fate.
I did try to warn him.
Gabe called back from the front as we continued to drag the cart forward.
The centaurs won't attack whilst we remain in line and continue pulling. Those are the rules, and anyone who tries to break them will suffer the consequences.
I took on the solemn warning and remained silent for a moment. But I still had questions to ask, and Gabe seemed content to answer them. I don't understand what we're doing here, I shouted up the line. Okay, we can't escape into the desert, that's clear. But where are we going, and why are we pulling this damned cart?
We don't have any choice but to pull the cart. We're chained to it, as you can see. This is our punishment.
But why? I shouted back in frustration. What am I being punished for?
Only you can answer that question, Thomas.
I experienced an icy cold chill despite the overwhelming heat. I'm in hell then. I whispered solemnly.
No. Hell is what we're fleeing from. Look.
He pointed back towards the mountain where my journey had begun. We'd made some progress across the desert landscape, but not much. Still, I'd been so concerned with my immediate surroundings that I hadn't looked back. But now I saw it. A dark shadow was creeping across the mountainside, moving slowly but surely towards the desert floor. I was astonished to see an equinox, a distinct line in the sand between night and day. The far side of the mountain was completely shrouded in darkness, and all the land behind the peak was consumed by the black. But that wasn't the half of it, because there was something far more sinister lurking in that blackness.
Just listen.
I did listen, ignoring the grind of the wheels churning through the sand, the clinking of heavy chains, and the grunts of the tired prisoners. Ignoring all this, I heard the faint noise carried by the hot desert wind, the sound of people crying out in misery and pain, pleading for mercy from some unseen force which was surely evil.
Weeping, wailing, and the gnashing of teeth. What you hear is the sound of those excluded from God's kingdom. Theirs is a miserable existence dwelt in the darkness. They are consumed by their anguish, regret, and anger.
He paused briefly to let those words sink in, because the worst part was still to come.
As you can see, the shadow is moving. The darkness will creep across this land over the coming hours. We must stay ahead of it. Otherwise, we too will be consumed.
I shook my head in dismay, struggling to process the enormity of what I was hearing. But we can't go on like this forever. These people are exhausted, I exclaimed while looking at the chain gang members struggling beside me. Most didn't react to my statement, but a few nodded their heads in agreement.
We don't have to pull forever,
Gabe replied defensively.
We have a destination. Look.
This time he pointed forwards, into the seemingly endless desert ahead. At first, I could hardly see anything through the simmering heat from the powerful sun. But then I spotted what Gabe was pointing to. A structure of white stone standing in the middle of the desert sands.
Our sanctuary. This fort is God's outpost in this wicked land. Once we enter its walls, we are safe from the creeping shadow. This is our objective, my friends.
I looked back at the advancing darkness and then forward to the far distant fort. We had a long way to go, a lot of ground to cover through an extreme and hostile environment. Our people would surely weaken and fall under the intense heat of the sun, becoming unable to manage the heavy weight of the wagon. As for the shadow, yes, it was moving slowly, but the darkness was also relentless, as we would find out to our detriment. This was an unstoppable force of nature. Our only hope was to outrun it, and I honestly didn't think we'd make it. But there was nowhere else to go and no other hope of salvation. So I continued to pull with all my might. The hard slog continued, and a grim and brutal routine fell into place. Everything about the environment and circumstances seemed designed to wear us down, both physically and mentally. Even the method of pulling the wagon was insane. It would have made more sense to attach harnesses to our backs, even though this would have reduced us to the state of livestock. It wasn't long before I discovered the purpose of the open bed. As predicted, the weakest of our number couldn't continue the hard labor. One by one they fell, and when they did so, we carefully loaded their frail bodies onto the bed of the wagon. The cart was designed for us to carry the weak and lame, which was better than having to drag their limp bodies across the hot sands. As men and women fell, others arrived. Fresh chains shot out of the wagon as if by magic, and human bodies were pulled from the sand, appearing like they were being spit out by some monstrosity beneath the ground. Some came out kicking and screaming, and they needed Gabe's soothing words to calm them. Meanwhile, others simply joined the gang without a word or objection, acting like this was all routine. This was the pattern. But there was an obvious problem. More people were falling than were joining. Those who were loaded onto the carts had to be carried, which increased the total weight we had to pull. There weren't enough replacements to make up the numbers, so inevitably, our pace slowed. This was a huge concern, because the force of nature chasing after us did not stop or slow. I tried to avoid looking at the ever-expanding shadow cast across the desert floor, but unfortunately, the dreaded weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth only grew louder and more intense. It became almost unbearable as my exhausted mind was filled with images of damned and tortured souls suffering within the eternal darkness. It wasn't their pain and anguish that worried me the most. It was their anger. They hated us because we were still free. The term free seemed ridiculous given our circumstances. Chained up half naked and forced to pull the wagon through this unforgiving desert. But still, we had a chance, however slim. If we made it to the fort, we'd survive. The damned didn't have that escape. All they could do was drag us down to hell with them, and they would if they caught us. Fear of the shadow kept us going, but our conditions only deteriorated. The sun beat down on us constantly. I felt my skin burning and peeling. My hands and bare feet became bloody from the hard labor, and I felt my mind slowly slipping as the immense heat took its toll. There was no escape from the chain gang. Frank O'Neill's grisly demise had proven as much. Occasionally, we spotted the centaurs on our flanks, keeping their distance, but reminding us of their hostile presence. The beasts howled with hatred, their eyes lighting up as they randomly fired arrows and flung spears in our direction. Their projectiles always narrowly missed us, whizzing over our heads or striking the sands by our feet. But the centaurs weren't trying to hit us, only to intimidate. Gabe assured us that they couldn't hurt any member of our gang, not as long as we stayed in line. Nevertheless, the combination of these deadly factors would eventually be enough to break any man or woman. We were all suffering, but it was Gabe who kept us going. The old man spoke to each and every one of us, whispering encouragement in our ears when we needed him the most. And then, of course, there was his magic canteen. He passed it down the line and everyone took a drink. We only ever took our fill, and yet one small canteen was somehow enough to quench the thirst of 36 people. The water kept on flowing and the canteen never ran dry. There was little talk from within the chain gang, but I was able to engage some of my fellow prisoners in brief conversation, learning their names and where they hailed from. Sully from Manchester, Dante from Chicago, Isabella from Barcelona, Pierre from Quebec. On the surface, we had nothing in common, but for whatever reason we were in this situation together, brought to this bizarre and frightening realm following our respective deaths. We formed a comradeship during those hellish hours, working together under Gabe's leadership as we pulled the wagon ever onwards and loaded the weakened lame onto the cart. This camaraderie brought hope to my heart, despite the desperate situation. But there was one thing left unsaid between us. Gabe had hinted at it when I first arrived here. Only you know why. And there was a reason I'd been sent here. I was a sinner, and the crime I'd committed in life weighed heavily on me. I tried to put the guilt to the back of my mind, but the desert forced me to confront the harsh reality in the most unexpected way. It all started with my mother's illness. Cancer of the liver. They caught it late, but there was still hope. An aggressive course of chemotherapy was recommended by the doctors, but Mom didn't have the medical insurance to cover the cost. Mom had always been there for me, sacrificing everything after Dad died to put food on the table and bring me up right. She'd even supported me emotionally after my messy divorce. There was no way I was going to let Mom down when she needed me the most. But it was tough. I burnt through all my savings, took out a second mortgage on my home, and borrowed heavily. All this put me in substantial debt, but it still wasn't enough. I was desperate, and that's how they reeled me in. The Diablos were the biggest gang inside our prison. They controlled the drug trade inside, that was no secret. The new governor made a big deal of trying to stop the illegal narcotics trade and found pretext to fire the crooked guards responsible for smuggling in the drugs. This was a problem for the Diablos and their boss Jose. Demand was high, but the main supply had been cut off. That's when Jose approached me with an offer. Now, I'd been an honest guard my entire career up to that point. I'd never taken a bribe or even looked the other way. But like I said, I was desperate. Jose wanted me to smuggle in the drugs which his gang would sell. He would pay me handsomely for my illicit services. I knew it was wrong, of course I did. But I justified the act as best as I could. Drugs were going to make their way inside either way, they always did. Where there was a demand, there would always be a supply. And it's not like anyone was forcing prisoners to take illegal substances. They were criminals getting high, that's all. Besides, I wasn't doing this out of greed. My actions were born out of necessity. The first few runs went smoothly. No one suspected me of wrongdoing, and the dealing was done on the down low. Jose paid me the money and I was able to cover the payments for Mom's treatment. But then, one Sunday afternoon, it all went to hell. 10 overdoses on my wing, 3 of them fatal, 3 prisoners dead on my watch, killed by the illicit drugs I'd smuggled in. After the initial chaos was done, the investigation began. The autopsies confirmed that the cocaine in the dead man's systems was laced with fentanyl. Whether the spiking was intentional or not, I'll never know, but I lied to the investigators and said I knew nothing about the ODs. I was sure they didn't believe me and expected to be arrested any day, but it never happened. The investigation team never discovered my involvement. I got away with it, even though the guilt weighed me down. And in the end, it was all for nothing. My mom's treatment didn't take, and she died 2 months later. I never told her what I'd done to pay for her chemo. Couldn't bring myself to. I was by my mom's side when she passed. She said she loved me, was proud of me. She said I shouldn't blame myself, that I did all I could. If only she knew. But the desert, whoever ran this cursed realm, they did know. The celestial powers were fully aware of my earthly sins. And finally, I was forced to face divine judgment. I never forgot the names of the 3 prisoners who died due to my actions. The names and faces of those young men were etched into my guilt-ridden memory for all eternity. Andre Jackson, prisoner number 2317. Convicted of larceny, committed to support his drug addiction. Emilio Sanchez, prisoner number 6728. Convicted of assault carried out as part of a gang initiation. And Sammy Bailey, prisoner number 4621. Convicted of causing a death while driving under the influence. All criminals, but not the worst under my watch. They'd taken drugs in part to escape the desperation and violence inside the prison. A slippery slope. But these 3 men would all have got out one day. Maybe they would have turned their lives around, but I'd robbed them of this chance. A trio of dead prisoners forgotten by the mortal world, but the desert remembered. I thought I was hallucinating at first, assuming the unforgiving heat and dehydration had finally overwhelmed me. But I must believe my experiences during that telling interlude were genuine, because the dead came to visit me, one by one. Jackson, Sanchez, and Bailey. Ghosts emerging from the sweltering sands, their eyes full of anger, a righteous fury directed towards me. They shouted curses, telling me how their lives had been stolen away thanks to my thoughtless actions. I tried to apologize, to show genuine remorse, but my words fell on deaf ears. It seemed there was nothing I could say or do to assuage their collective anger. I didn't get any help from the others either. All my fellow prisoners simply kept their heads down and kept on pulling. Even Gabe couldn't help me. The old man seemed oblivious to my situation. It seemed I was on my own with the guilt. It was only later that I realized how my comrades were facing their own demons. The desert was full of ghosts, and all would be confronted by their sins. The heat, the exhaustion, the shadow, and the ghosts. Combined, these hellish elements drove me close to insanity. I was about to give up, to collapse into the sand and let the shadow take me. But the next development surprised me and renewed my flagging spirit. Because the trio of ghosts made one final appearance, emerging once more from the burning desert to confront me. Except this time, the spirits weren't here to reprimand me. The fury had left their eyes, replaced by something resembling compassion. And when the three spoke, they did so as one, crying out across the void. "Keep pulling! Keep on pulling!" And that's exactly what I did. We'd come so far, the fort was in sight now, tantalizingly close. But more and more of our number had fallen, needing to be loaded onto the now crowded wagon. Those who were left in the lines were mentally and physically drained, me included, but worst of all was the creeping shadow, that darkness that was now almost on top of us. A wall of blackness had devoured the desert behind us, and the hellish din was overwhelming. The wailing, weeping, and gnashing so loud and intense that it drove me to the very brink. Fear was keeping us going. Fear of what would become of us if we fell into the shadow, but I didn't know whether it would be enough. The biggest blow came when Gabe fell. In truth, the old man had made little physical contribution to the pulling of the cart. Even so, he'd been instrumental in keeping up morale and ensuring the wagon kept on rolling. But now Gabe could no longer stand, let alone walk. I helped to carry his frail body and load him into the cart with all the others. As I did so, the old man took my hand and forced me to look him in the eye.
"It's up to you now, Thomas. You must lead our people to the finish line."
My jaw dropped and I shook my head. How could Gabe put this heavy responsibility on my tired shoulders? How would I even accomplish the near impossible task? I wanted to tell him no, but when I looked into Gabe's deep eyes, I knew I could not refuse him. It wasn't just for Gabe or my people in the line. I had to do this for myself. This was my path to redemption. Gabe had one last gift for me. His magic water canteen. I rallied the remaining chain gang members, allowing them all to take a drink before our final push. We were all frightened, our eardrums bombarded by the awful din of the damned. Yes, we were terrified, but also determined. The sanctuary of the fort was so close, only yards away now, but my people were so tired, and the burden of the bodies in the wagon was so heavy. Our speed reduced to a snail's pace, and we were fast running out of time. I threw everything I had into the final push, ignoring the baking sun, the ominous shadow, and ungodly din as I shouted words of encouragement to my people, my voice going hoarse as I struggled to be heard over the cries of the damned. Somehow, we reached the open gates of the fabled white fort, and the men and women in the lines practically crawled over the threshold. But they could pull no longer, instead collapsing down to the sands in complete exhaustion. The wagon itself was still outside the fort's walls, and the shadow had caught us. Everything seemed to move in slow motion. I could only watch in horror as the darkness crept along the bed of the cart. Those at the back cried out in abject horror as the advancing shadow consumed their physical forms and absorbed their souls into its realm of eternal suffering. There was a panic in the wagon as those at the back desperately tried to claw their way forward, climbing over the bodies of their comrades in the process, but it seemed they were only delaying the inevitable as the deadly shadow advanced ever forward. I knew all these souls would be doomed unless I took action. Digging into the last reserves of strength, I dragged myself off the hot sands and darted forward, climbing up onto the cart and putting my hands upon the mass of bodies. One by one, I pulled the weak and frail and flung them up over the side of the wagon. I don't know how I found the strength to do so, but somehow I managed it. Gabe was one of those I had managed to save. I saw the thin smile on his lips before I tossed him. The heat was no longer a problem, at least. In fact, the temperature dropped to near freezing due to the close proximity of the shadow. It was only inches away from me now, the screams and bloody chaos drowning out every other sound. I saved as many as I could from the darkness, but others were taken before I could get my hands on them. Next, I jumped off the cart and started dragging the bodies by their chains, pulling them across the threshold one at a time. Others found the strength to help, and against all odds, we pulled our people to safety. The job done, I collapsed back down to the sand, exhausted but satisfied that I'd done all I could. Gabe had been true to his word. The shadow could not cross the threshold. I glanced up to see the wall of darkness now stalled at the gates of the fortress, and the terrible sound, the wailing and gnashing of teeth. This din had stopped abruptly, replaced by an ominous silence. I didn't know what would happen next. What we were supposed to do? I looked to Gabe, expecting to see him lying half dead on the sand. But the old man was back on his feet, apparently back to full strength as he looked down upon me with bright eyes and a smile on his crusty lips as he congratulated me.
Well done, Thomas.
I stared back at him in confusion before the scene rapidly changed. In an instant, the wall of darkness and its icy cold atmosphere disappeared, leaving behind the now empty wagon, rolling desert, and the mountain in the far distance. I was amazed, but there was more to come. A moment later, and a mighty wind blasted across the desert floor, kicking up sand as it blew in our direction. Instinctively, I covered my face with my hands to protect my eyes, feeling the hot wind wash over me as the sand cut into my skin. But soon it was over, and I opened my eyes and struggled to my feet. What I saw astonished me, because the wagon, the fort, and all my comrades had disappeared, all seemingly swept away by the desert wind. Only Gabe remained, but he transformed into something else. I stood frozen under the baking sun as Gabe rapidly grew in stature, suddenly rising to at least 8 feet in height, while his formerly frail body became bronzed and muscular, and his tired eyes were sharp and focused. But most astonishing of all was the vast pair of feathered wings that sprouted from his back, spreading to cast a large silhouette across the desert floor. It was only then that I realized the obvious truth. Gabe was in fact Gabriel, the Archangel. Frankly, I was left awestruck and more than a bit frightened while looking up at the celestial being. However, I was glad to see the friendly smile still on his lips and decided that he meant me no harm. I don't understand, I stuttered nervously. What was the point of all this?
A test,
Gabe replied firmly, his booming voice carrying across the void.
You committed a grave sin on the mortal plane, Thomas. This much was known, but there were extenuating circumstances in your case, and we felt you deserved a second chance.
The angel paused, nodding back towards the sands.
Your trials and tribulations in the desert. We gave you the opportunity for redemption. And I'm glad to say you rose to the challenge. Not only did you reach the endpoint, but you put yourself at risk to save others. Impressive, Thomas.
I felt genuine pride in that moment, allowing myself a thin smile. But I was still confused by the situation. What happens now? Can I go home?
Alas, no.
Gabriel answered as his smile faded ever so slightly.
Your time on Earth is at an end, and your death cannot be reversed. It is my genuine belief that you will find peace in this afterlife. But there is still work to be done to save your soul.
What does that mean? I demanded, as a new fear ran through my weary bones. Gabriel didn't answer, at least not directly. Instead, he simply clicked his fingers, prompting the sand beneath my feet to give way, sucking me down into the abyss. Gabriel's parting words were the last I heard as he said,
Good luck, Thomas. I will see you on the other side.
And then I lost consciousness as the darkness took me. I awoke in another place, different yet also chillingly familiar. Chilling was the right word because the first thing I noticed was the bitter cold. I was back in darkness, with only a dim light illuminating the ceiling above me. There I spotted ice-covered stalactites that looked dangerously close to falling. Pulling my aching body up, I realized I was no longer clad in sparse rags. Instead, my form was kitted out in heavy furs and boots, which did something to quell the cold. There was something else, too. A metal flask that hung from my belt and was warm to the touch. It didn't take long to realize that I was still in chains, with the iron collar sealed around my neck. Clearly, I was in another cave, and the hellish process was starting all over again. I didn't fight when the chains started to pull, instead accepting my fate as I was dragged across the frozen cave and towards the narrow opening. As soon as I reached the outside, I was hit by an ice-cold wind and found myself trekking through heavy snow. Looking forward through the snowfall, I noted how my chain was attached to a mighty sleigh, roughly the same dimensions as the wagon in the previous realm. A fiery desert had been replaced by an icy landscape, but the game was still the same. Men and women, clad in furs, were chained to the sleigh, waiting for someone to tell them what was happening. All present seemed confused and scared, and I couldn't blame this of them. I heard a distant howl of what might have been a wolf, or perhaps something worse. In the far distance, through the blizzard, I could make out a fort of black stone. Behind me was a vast mountain, and I observed the dark shadow slowly creeping across the mountainside. Instinctively, I realized what I must do. What was expected of me? I called out to the new chain gang, taking charge as I passed around the flask, inviting them all to drink the hot liquid contained within. Next, I explained the situation to the newcomers. We must work as a team, and we must reach the fort before the shadow takes us. Otherwise, we're all doomed. As we set across the snow-covered plain, I made a promise to myself. This time, I wouldn't lose anyone to the darkness. This time, I would do better. Hey everybody, Kevin here from Nightmares Nightly. If you made it this far, I want to thank you all for listening, and thank you to We Try Horror and Charon's Tales for featuring in this video. Also, a huge, overwhelming thank you goes out to Mark Lynch, aka Wound Liquor, aka Hell Tourist, aka Finn McCool. And there's at least one other one in there that I think I'm missing. Traveler. There we go. So Mark actually reached out to me about a month or so ago and was asking about some personalized stories, or Mark wanted, if I remember correctly, he asked me if there was a series or a story that I'd like for him to write or expand upon, maybe. And I told him, Mark, I've had this idea for a very long time. I've tried to write it. I just couldn't quite figure out how the plot was going to be, what the conflict and how the resolution would end up. And I bounced some ideas off of Mark, which, starting with the title, "In Hell There Is a Cart, and Everyone Must Pull." So, I kind of sent him that. I sent him some details about what I wanted, if possible, if he was open to it, what I wanted this story to be about. And one of the big focuses was, when I was a kid, and growing up, I was always terrified of, I'm a Christian, as many of y'all may know, but I was always terrified of, in the Bible, in the New Testament, when they speak of hell, and it's called the weeping and gnashing of teeth. That shit just always freaked me out, and still does to an extent. I wanted that to be part of the story, and then I had this idea of a cart, that the weeping and gnashing of teeth is like the black shadow in this. That's people are chained to a cart, and hell is following the cart. Always. It's an ever-present force of nature, force of the universe, I should say, that is following this cart. And you're kind of in like a purgatory realm. I think actually originally I thought it was just going to be in hell, and it's almost like if you get caught by the weeping and gnashing, it's even worse. But then Mark bounced some ideas off. We sent multiple emails back and forth, fleshing the story out. And then I was like, then he kind of had the idea that it's almost like a purgatory realm, that the people are in. And then I was like, oh, you know what? I really like that idea. And then maybe if our protagonist, not everyone gets the chance that this protagonist has been offered. So kind of like, our protagonist is too bad for heaven, but, and deserving of hell. But there are a few souls that will, every now and then be tested, that get the chance to get out of hell, in a sense. And our protagonist wasn't an evil person. And he was offered, unbeknownst to him, offered this opportunity to go through a purgatory-like state. And everyone that's chained to that, at least I don't know how Mark feels about this, but my view is everyone that's chained to that wagon in particular is in hell, basically. They're not in hell, but they're deserving of hell. They're not getting the second chance that our protagonist has been given. He was chained to this specific cart or wagon for his redemption, not for anybody else's. So the other souls don't really matter, to me at least. And he's chained to this, and if he overcomes whatever challenges that he might face, then he can earn a spot in heaven eventually. He has to go through, and that was kind of Mark's idea of putting this into purgatory, I think. And then I was like, I love that idea. And then I'm like, if he goes through enough of these, almost like circles of hell. You can even say he's in a circle of hell, not purgatory. Maybe he's in a circle of hell where these are his tribulations, his trials. And if he makes it through, he will eventually, and as you see in the end, he's not done. That first one was his trial. He has many more trials ahead of him. And Gabriel is there as like the guardian angel, in the sense that he is there to witness what our protagonist is doing, how he goes through this trial, and if he is worthy of ascending to heaven. And he's going to go through many, many more challenges. I thought it was nice to contrast. I actually think maybe Mark had the idea to contrast the first one. Mark is an incredible author. If y'all haven't already checked out the playlist, he has a playlist on the channel with like 30 or 40 stories. And if you like this, you'll definitely love I Traveled Through the 9 Circles of Hell. It's a 3-hour story. Incredible. I did that a long time ago on the channel. It's one of my favorites too. What the hell was I just talking about? None of this is scripted at the end. I'm kind of this is all just free balling at the end. Right when I finish reading the story, this is all just free balling. What the hell was I just talking about? Oh yeah, Mark had the idea. My idea at first was this was going to take place in a dark cavern, very low light. Basically you're dragging like this thing through a cave, and you can barely even see the weeping and gnashing of teeth. You mainly just hear it, and it's a terrifying thing to hear. And you're almost in near darkness, and the punishment is pulling the wagon, and those who are exhausted get thrown onto the wagon, and then every soul, you start out with X amount of souls that are just pulling the wagon, and then everyone that gets exhausted eventually gets thrown onto the wagon, and then you need an ever-increasing amount of souls to make up for the fact that every soul that's pulling the wagon eventually gets tired, and then they get thrown onto the wagon, but then you need more souls to pull the extra weight. So that was the main idea of this story. That was the main challenge of it's just an endless feedback loop of you need people to pull the cart, but the more people that pull the cart, the more people end up on the cart, which makes more people needing to have to pull the cart. And like I said, my idea was to make this in a cavern, kind of, not much visuals. But then Mark came back with a lot of ideas, an incredible imagination and creativity Mark has. Because I would throw him like two or three ideas, and he'd come back with like 7. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's awesome, thank you. He came back with the idea of maybe you start in the cavern, and then they take this thing out onto like a desert wasteland. And I was like, okay, maybe. And then he started coming back with the idea of like, yeah, because that doesn't what's the word? It makes the punishment even worse. It exasperates it. I don't think that's the word. Exaggerates the punishment, because not only are they pulling this wagon, this cart, and picture, hopefully the thumbnail I make does it justice, but picture like an old Western style wagon without a top, without that like canvas top, just a huge colossal thing of wood, creaking wood. And he's like, dude, this has got to be in the desert because it makes the punishment so much worse. And then he sent me back the idea of like, they're going to be baking under a desert sun. There's no escape from the sunlight. Your skin is just peeling. You're blistering. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's so much better than just being in a dark, dingy cavern. Like the dark cavern is a little more scarier and a little more ominous. But then I'm like, wait, oh yeah, that does make the punishment worse because now you're just under the sun that you cannot escape. There's nothing from it. They're in rags. Basically they got loincloths on, and that blistering heat makes it so much worse. And I love that idea. And then he even, had the idea of like, yeah, you can technically unchain yourself, but you're gonna get speared or just destroyed by ever-present, ever-roaming minotaurs that are around. And then he did something that we didn't talk about because I just instinctively thought that I really enjoyed this though. I instinctively just thought that Mark was gonna have the people chained by the waist. Like you just got like a belt on basically, and you're chained that way, and people are pulling forward like cattle, like he says in there. But then I was reading the story that he sent me, and it was chained around the neck, and I was like, how do I feel about that? I'm not sure. And then I was reading through the story, and I was like, wow, that actually is that's even better because you don't have any like mechanical leverage or advantage that way. The punishment is even worse at this point because you're chained at the neck. but you have to hold the chain with your hands and walk backwards. I was like, gosh, that sucks. So me and Mark went back and forth for a while, just bouncing ideas off of each other. And guys, I can't tell you how cool Mark is. Please, please, please. I'm going to leave links. I do it every video, but I'm going to leave links for his books down below. I bought all of his stuff. Mark is an awesome author. He recently has a story that came out a few months ago, a novel that he released. If you love these hell pastas like I do, and I know y'all do, that's a big thing I do on my channel, please buy Mark's book. It's all about hell and these challenges that people have to face down there. I'm going to leave that probably in a pinned comment down below, and it'll be in the description as well. Some Amazon affiliate links down there. Please check his stuff out. He's got an Amazon page too, because he's got plenty of other stuff on there. Please show Mark some love in the comments down below. He's a big author. Y'all have heard him all over this channel. You've heard him all over Dark Somnium. He has a lot, and he writes a lot of these hell stories. And that's not the only thing he writes. He's got I'm sure y'all have heard the like the Astri storyline, the sci-fi line or plot line on Dark Somnium's channel. I'm a captive in an alien war, something like that. I woke up aboard an alien spacecraft. That's on Somnium's channel, all written by Mark. He specializes in many fields. A really cool one too on the channel, if you want another long series, is the SVA, the Supernatural Vigilante Association. That's on my channel. I don't know who else has done it, but I've got that compilation out. It's like a 2.5-hour story about a journalist that goes around documenting these supernatural individuals. That's a cool one too. Like I said, please show Mark some love. Check his work out. And I really appreciate you all being here. Remember, every Monday is a live stream of me live reading. If y'all can, please join those and make it. And as always, thanks for listening, everybody.